Welcome, everybody. You guys are daredevils. Yeah. Yeah, me too. If it was up to me, we wouldn't change anything, but anyway, I don't want to say too much. Well, we're doing a series called Counterculture where we kind of compare the ways of the world with the ways of God, obviously with the intention of being able to identify which are which and to be able to walk in the ways of Jesus better. So today we're going to do that with the concepts of good and evil. This is actually a message that I was going to do. I think maybe if you were here, you remember me saying 3 weeks ago, before we did the healthy church culture thing, this is the message that I said I was going to do, and I felt like the Lord was like, wait on that one. And now I totally see why, because we could not have had any idea that this whole virus thing was going to happen and all that, all the repercussions from that. But this message actually, in an awkward way, really parallels that in some ways. You'll see. I don't know how to explain it other than just to explain it. Romans 12:9 says, "Hate what is evil, cling to what is good." So God, we give ourselves to you, Lord, and we ask that you would open our hearts and minds. Lord, help me to really just say what you want to say. People don't need opinions. People don't need, a man's thoughts. We need the heart of God. So, Lord, I believe as I've prepared this message, God, that you're speaking through your word. You're speaking through everyday life by your Spirit. And so we invite you into this message, our ability to receive it, and my ability to rightly divide the word of truth and to give this message. In Jesus' name, amen. So, hate what is evil, cling to what is good. If you're like me, you've probably never met anybody who didn't believe that there was such a thing as goodness, right? I mean, we see it all over the place, people doing good things. It's all over our media and the stories that we read. There's always a good hero, right? Not always, but I mean, a lot of times there's someone who's willing to sacrifice themselves, for others. So goodness is just something we take for granted and we know. And that concept is also all through the Bible. From page 1, God said, "Let there be light," the first act of creation, and there was light, and God saw that light was good. So the concept of goodness is all over the Word of God, and, we take for granted that it exists, but that's not true with evil. Did you know there's a lot of people that don't believe evil exists? In fact, if you're a Facebook friend of mine, maybe you saw the debate I had with a friend of mine who doesn't believe in evil. So as strange as that sounds, some people don't believe in evil. But, it's hard to even think about the concept of goodness without acknowledging that evil exists. I mean, think about it. What would the word light mean if there was no such thing as darkness? What would wet mean if there was no such thing as dryness? What would happy mean if there was no such thing as sadness? It's not to say that those things, couldn't exist without their opposites, but there would be no way for us to even comprehend it if they did, right? I mean, think about it. If we wouldn't have words like hot and cold if the only thing we've ever experienced in this universe is one temperature, right? So the fact that people seem to take for granted and universally accept that the fact that there's goodness means that whether they know it or not, they do believe in the concept of evil. But despite that rational thinking, evil as a category has pretty much disappeared from our institutions of higher learning and from many other institutions and organizations in our world. Evil is disappearing as a concept. So this is where we diverge. This is where counterculture comes in, right? You see, The world's view of good and evil is relative. Means like there's no absolute way to define them. Now, relative thinking is fine when it comes to something, whether or not you think sauerkraut is good. I'm sure there's lots of strong opinions about that. But when we talk about something like morality, when we try to make that subjective, I'm afraid that that's really broken. It has really severe implications. Let me come up with an analogy. So like if I was to say to someone, they need directions, and I go down 1 mile, and at exactly 1 mile, turn right. And let's just say that the person goes, great, and he takes off. But what if my belief about what a mile is different than their belief? What if I believe it's 5,280 feet, and they believe it's 5 feet or 50,000 feet? Well, there's going to be some pretty significant problems, right? Well, that's a great picture of what's happening in morality today. And many people are lost because of it. With all this talk about pandemic lately, moral confusion is the age-old, ongoing pandemic of the soul. Did you hear me? Moral confusion is the pandemic of the soul. And you know what? This disease, it doesn't just destroy individuals. It destroys entire cultures. Lots of them. Does that sound like an exaggeration or some hyper-spiritual mumbo-jumbo? It's not. It's actually objective fact. When I was studying for this series, a few weeks ago, I ran across this book, Sex and Culture by J.D. Unwin. It's a big book. It's like 650 pages, so I didn't read it word for word. Actually, not because it was a big book, but because I didn't understand half of what he was saying. But he's an anthropologist, and anyways, I found a really good summary that some philosopher did, and he translated it for us layfolk, and I read that. And basically, what the book is about 86 societies that Unwin researched very deeply. Actually, he researched way more than 86, but he had such a high standard for what kind of data he was accepting. It had to be really strong, clear data. So 86 cultures made the cut, and he researched them and did an incredible job. I mean, this is a really well-done book. But you know what? The outcome that he came to in this book was completely surprising to him. He even wrote in the preface, he said, if I would have known before I started my research what the results would be, I might not have done it. Because he didn't expect to prove what he proved. In fact, he was hoping to prove the opposite than what he actually found. He's not a believer. This book is not about religious morality. It's not about God in any way, shape, or form, at least not intentionally. This is just pure anthropology. But the implications of this book are deeply spiritual. So I'm going to give you a real super brief summary of some of his findings. First of all, the effect of increased sexual constraints, meaning holding back, in a culture always led to increased flourishing in that culture. On the flip side, increased sexual freedom always led to the collapse of that culture only 3 generations in. Let me just make a statement here. When an anthropologist uses words like always and every and all and stuff like that, they don't mean it in the way that we kind of use it. Like if somebody says to me, I'm never late, I go, what you actually mean is I'm usually not late, right? But when an anthropologist uses words like always and never, they mean always, without exception, always. So let me read those two things again. Increased sexual constraints in a culture always led to increased flourishing. Increased sexual freedom always led to the collapse of a culture 3 generations later. That's crazy, isn't it? Next, you know what the most influential, this is shocking, the most influential factor concerning whether or not a culture flourished was whether or not they required abstinence before marriage. In other words, if it was normal for a culture to not have sex before they got married, they flourished. That was the highest indicator. If it was not normal, they did not flourish. And Unwin said, quote, "It was a very significant effect either way," end quote. He was surprised by that. I bet many of you are. I was. Anyways, next, he looked at the attributes of cultures that reached the highest level of flourishing. And the most influential combination was no sex before marriage and only sex with your partner after marriage. Cultures that had this combination for at least 3 generations exceeded all, there's that word again, all other cultures in every area. Isn't that crazy? That includes literature and art and science and architecture and engineering and agriculture and even furniture, everything. They exceeded all other cultures. Unfortunately, only 3 out of the 86 cultures reached that level of flourishing. Next, when abstaining from premarital sex was no longer the normal kind of expected behavior, then 3 things happened clearly. Absolute monogamy disappeared, belief in God disappeared, and rational thinking disappeared. What I mean by rational thinking is basically just believing that truth exists. That's kind of the foundation of rational thinking. See, when premarital sex was accepted as normal, rational thinking went out the window. They didn't believe in truth anymore. But can I just say, I can't ever bring this up without just saying, it's irrational to think truth doesn't exist. Because if I say truth doesn't exist, then that sentence is subject to itself. Do you know what I mean by that? If I say truth doesn't exist, then the phrase truth doesn't exist can't be correct. It can't be true because truth doesn't exist. It's irrational. I could say a whole lot more about that, but basically, if you think like that, then there's no basis for believing anything. A mile can mean whatever you want it to mean, and that's how people end up lost. Finally, if total sexual freedom was embraced by a culture, it collapsed within 3 generations to its lowest state of flourishing. And what that means is the social energy and creativity and productivity, it all disappears. And basically people just didn't have any interest in anything except for their own wants and their own needs anymore. Remember, this isn't a religious book. It's well-founded. I would encourage you to read it if you can stomach it. or read the summary. I can send it to you if you're interested in that. But once this happened in a culture, once they accepted total freedom and these things played out over 3 generations, then what typically happened is that culture was overthrown or it was taken over by something or someone else, a culture that had greater social energy and moral clarity. Every single time. That's just objective reality, you guys. So what does that mean for America? What does that mean for us? Well, I want to look at 3 different aspects in answer to this question. What does it mean for America? You know, we're taking this coronavirus seriously, aren't we? You know, is it warranted the level of reaction? I don't know. I mean, it's costing our nation. I know business owners that are really suffering because everything just went out the window. Churches that are suffering. I mean, our attendance, I'm expecting, is going to remain low through this whole thing. But you know what? If it's saving lives, it's worth it. You know, is it saving lives? I'm not an expert. I don't know. But my point is this. We should have at least the same level of careful consideration when dealing with this pandemic of moral decay in our culture. Because the long-term consequences are serious. These patterns that Unwin unveiled, they are so consistent and so absolute that they scream for our attention. Where are we in this progression? Well, think about it. The sexual revolution in America started in the late 1960s. So we actually have the ability to see if we're tracking along the same lines as what he predicted. And we are, with scary realism, scary accuracy. Monogamous marriage is declining significantly, just like he predicted. Belief in God is declining significantly, just like he predicted. Rational thinking dropped like a lead balloon after the 70s, just like he predicted. Now, we know he couldn't have just observed our society and kind of made it fit, because this book was published in 1934. You know, it goes way back. It goes, cultures like Rome were included in this study. The Babylonians. This is well-established patterns, and much more recent cultures too. So, could we be the exception to the rule? It's possible. But it would be kind of stupid to think that way, wouldn't it? We wouldn't treat a disease like that. Oh, maybe it won't get us sick when we breathe it in. We don't think that way. It would be dumb. So you know what? We may need to quarantine. Now, don't freak out. I'm not saying, hey, let's buy some land in South America and I got some Kool-Aid for you. Woohoo! No, I mean that figuratively. What I mean is, we need to look at the most vulnerable in our culture, meaning our children. And maybe we need to be careful who we let them learn from, that we're not allowing people to convince them that immorality has no consequences. We need to protect our children from that. We need to be careful what we touch. And if we're infected, we need to be careful not to share our poison with others. Because according to this really solid research, we're headed for a collapse of flourishing at best, and the demise of our nation, worst case scenario. And if this 3 generations pattern remains true for us, we have 50 years left. Kind of scary, isn't it? Another thing that his research shows is the Bible is right about morality. Shocking. You know what? Secular people mock the sexual restrictions found in the scriptures. They think it's ridiculous, and outdated and, that's the dark ages, Then you read something like Unwin's book, and it provides solid scientific evidence that the Bible is relevant throughout all cultures and all times. Let me just say this. Listen, God doesn't tell us to abstain from certain things because he wants to spoil your fun. He says thou shalt not because he knows the results of those things. He loves you, and he doesn't want you to go 50,000 miles when you're only supposed to go 5,280 or whatever. Okay, Greg, don't wing it. He says it because he loves you. You'd be like, oh, but God doesn't doesn't God want us to be free? Doesn't the Bible say, he who the Son sets free is free indeed? It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Yeah, absolutely. But you have to understand what freedom means. I like to use this analogy about a fish. A fish is only free if it's restricted to the water. Why? Because that's how it's made. It breathes water. It doesn't breathe air. Another way I like to talk about it is a river is only a blessing when it stays in the banks. When it exceeds the banks, it becomes something that's called a flood, and that is destructive. So listen, the way we find true moral freedom and clarity is by restricting ourselves to the boundaries that God gave us, because that's how we're made. We won't thrive. We will not flourish outside of that. It's not because you're bad. It's not because it's because this is what happens when you do that. And then evil can enter your heart. Where does evil enter in? Evil is when you go, I know that's what I believe in God, I know that's what he wants me to do, and I'm not going to do it. That is evil, my friends. I'm sorry. I'm not sorry. That's the reality. Now, to set you at ease for those of you who are going, oh, ow, I'm evil. I am too. We're all evil. We all want things that God doesn't want us to have. Whew. So, welcome to this gathering of sinners. But just remember, those boundaries are there because God loves you and he knows the results. Finally, this is something we all need to hear right now, isn't it? We have reason to hope. I'm going to be honest with you. I really felt like the Lord was saying, this is the message today. I wrestled really hard with it all Thursday. I'm going, God, with everything else that's going on, I'm going to give a message like this? He's like, yep. Okay. So I just went to work, and as I'm thinking through this, I realized that this is actually really good news for several reasons. First of all, we have reason to hope because there's a remnant of people all over our nation that love God and care about the boundaries that he's given for us. And if you're one of those, you need to know God sees you. He knows that. He knows. Even in your failures, he sees us. He knows us. So him seeing us might be a comfort and it might be terrifying. It depends on how you think you're doing. But listen, none of us deserve his mercy. None of us do. That's not what this is about. Just commit your whole self to him, flaws and all. You don't have to clean things up to come to him. Just come and go, oh, I got all this baggage. Just come. So commit yourself wholly to him, and you have nothing to worry about. Did you hear that? Commit yourself to God and you have nothing to worry about. God was willing to spare Sodom and Gomorrah for the sake of only 10 righteous people. I'm convinced that he will spare the millions of people that love Jesus in this country. I'm convinced. We also have reason to hope because we do have moral clarity. We do. We have the Word. It's super clear on this topic. We have the Spirit in us that goes, oh, I know I probably shouldn't be doing that. I probably shouldn't be doing that. Well, you should probably listen to that voice. Give it a try. But for the most part, we're living in monogamous marriages, aren't we? We are embracing the boundaries that God gives us. I know that's not true for all of us. I know Christians are light years away from being perfect in these areas. Light years. But the key is we're not trying to twist God's truth to fit our reality. Because that's what destroys countries. Isaiah 5:20 says, woe to those that call evil good and good evil. It's that twisting that destroys nations. It's when we make heroes out of people that are flying in the face of God's boundaries. It's when we glorify and celebrate rebellion. I know that stuff is happening writ large in our country, but there's millions of believers out there that reject that twisting. Even if they're making mistakes, or even if they're rebelling, even they're not going, but I'm not rebelling, this is good. You will never be able to wipe that clean from your soul because God's law is written on your heart. It is. I'm convinced that that's why so many activists, they want to change the laws. They want everybody to accept it. Well, you're a Christian. Well, I don't care. You're a bad person if you believe that certain sexual things are wrong. They need you to accept it because they can't wipe that clean from their own soul because it's written on their heart. Maybe if everybody agrees, it'll make that guilt go away. It won't. And the last reason we have to hope that I have time to talk about, we have lots of reasons to hope, but the last one that I want to talk about is we are the remnant. We have a counterculture. We have a community that is following God. And that's normal and accepted and celebrated. Thank God for Renovate. Thank God for other churches that are preaching the truth because less and less of them are willing to talk about what I'm talking about right now. And I think that's sad. I understand the possible repercussions of talking about what I'm talking about. But you know what? I also understand the repercussions of not talking about what I'm talking about. Especially when God said, talk about it. You better talk about it if God says talk about it. So we have a culture. Listen, that is so critical if we're going to survive the onslaught of moral decay that's pressing in on us every day through media, through friends, through pressure. Give in. Believe like I believe or you're bad. Bad? You mean evil? So you do believe in evil. You do believe in good. But it's whatever you feel. Wrong. A mile is 5,280 feet. So we have a community that loves good, absolute good, right? Everybody says they love good, but not everyone is willing to pay the cost of good, right? They don't want their restrictions. They don't want their freedom hindered. They don't want a God. They don't want an authority. They don't want someone telling them what to do, what's right and what's wrong. But listen, if he's not God, that makes you God. And let me just tell you, if history has taught us anything, humans make terrible gods. Terrible. Says the history major. True statement. So I thank God for this community where we can all agree to let God be God. Not the pastor, not the culture, not the government, not those that are setting the rules for us. God is God. And you know what? That makes it possible for us to have a culture like this. Imperfect as it is, we suck. I'm sorry, we do. We fail all the time. But just say, I failed. Don't go, oh, well, I don't think that's wrong. Yeah, it's wrong. Don't twist it so you feel better about yourself. It'll never work. Just call evil, evil, and good, good. I'm rambling now. But this culture is important. Why? Because think about what people face every day. See, it's really difficult for people to change their mind, when the culture has trained them from day one, sexual freedom, it's all good. Whatever your identity is, it's all good. It's a lie. And our culture has swallowed it, hook, line, and sinker. You know what that means? Did you ever go fishing and a fish swallows hook, line, and sinker? What happens when you remove that hook? I don't want to be graphic, but basically you rip their guts out. How's that for not graphic? So we're swimming against the current, since we're talking about fish and water and stuff. But seriously, think about the cultural pressure that our kids are facing, you guys. Oh, how do they not give in? Well, the answer is create a culture where it's normal to follow God and not normal to do things you shouldn't be doing. You don't guilt them. You don't, whatever. We talked about this last week. Remember I talked about there's two ways to handle stuff like this. There's correction and there's condemnation. This is not condemnation. This is no shame trip is being put on anybody here. How many of you in this room are completely innocent sexually? Raise your hand. One person, and she's a liar. And I say that because, listen, Jesus said if you've committed adultery, if you've lusted after a woman in your heart, you've committed adultery. So, I'm sorry, we're all screwed. Why do I say stuff like that? It's because there are people in here that aren't doing this. And you know what? Some of us are doing better with it than others, but we're all in the same boat. This is not a guilt trip. It's correction. Receive that correction. Don't twist it. Don't try to make good bad and bad good. Just call it what it is. I'm not saying fix it right away, whatever. Just call out to God for help and he'll help you. Call out to the church for help and we'll help you.